Exodus chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3, the New International Version tells us, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. That's Moses. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So then on your Heritage Sunday today, the Lord's Day, I want to talk about living beyond labels. Living beyond labels. You may be seated. Living beyond labels. So we see here Moses was born. He is an infant in our text. Well, when Moses was born, the Pharaoh of Egypt decreed that all Israelite babies, male babies, be killed. Yeah. And so this is happening in the time of Moses' infancy. But by God's providence, baby Moses escaped death and was brought up in Pharaoh's palace. Isn't that something? He was a baby in being hidden, but then finds himself in a palace. But I submit to us even on this morning that even though Moses was brought up in a palace and found himself in the Pharaoh, the king's palace, I would imagine that Moses still had to deal with people labeling him. Yes. Because you know how people can be. You know how humans can be. Labels. Now, sometimes labels can be good. If someone labels a person as kind, that's a good label. Confident is a good label. Down to earth is a good label. Smart is a good label. But sometimes people label others in bad ways. Sometimes there could be negative labels out there that people try to put on other people. I was reading an article the other day, and it gave 6 labels that our society needs to stop using. 6 labels in particular that are considered bad labels. Again, people will try to label you. One label that the article talked about was plus size model. Why do we use that label? Another that the article talked about was illegal immigrant. Another label was retard. Terrible label. Another label was crazy. And then there was the label addict. And then the article talked about the label homo. Oh yes, these labels, the article talked about how in our society we need to kill those labels. But what's interesting to me is that labels even find themselves in our churches. Oh yes, labels come to church. You know, I like to hear her sing, but why does she have to sing all the songs? Show off. Even in the church. I like to see him praise God, but it doesn't take all that. Church dancing machine. You know, labels, even in the church. I like to hear him speak, but why does he have to testify all the time? Talkative testifier. Labels even in the church. So then, this is Heritage Sunday, right? Even our foreparents, the foreparents of blacks in America, dealt with a horrible label in particular. For example, this label was called slave. They looked backwards and they thought to themselves, my parents were slaves. My grandparents were slaves. My great-grandparents were slaves. And then if they were to look in front of them, they thought to themselves, my children would be slaves. My grandchildren will be slaves. A label. My great-grandchildren possibly would even be slaves. Nothing in their earthly life told them that slavery was soon coming to an end. So then this was the label. Slave you are and slave you will always be. But there's more to the black experience than the label slave. You need to understand that when they arrived on the bank of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, they were placed in chains. They were free persons in Africa, brought to a strange land with this label placed on them, shackles on their wrists and on their ankles. The term slave was an oppressor's label. They didn't come here with that title as slave. Africans were those where people came to them to be taught. If you wanted to know something about medicine, you came to Africa. If you wanted to know something about science, you came to Africa. If you wanted to know something about mathematics, you sat at the feet of Africans. Greeks and all others came to Africa, you see, because that's where humanity originated in the first place. So slave was a label that oppressors gave. Wow. But I remind us that you have to live past your labels. You have to live beyond a label. Historically, blacks in America have lived beyond labels. And the fact of the matter is, no matter what color your skin is, once you accept Jesus Christ, you live beyond a label because you're more than a conqueror. You don't live defeated when you follow Jesus Christ because you get a name. Because you follow the one whose name is above all names. Yes. So then my question for you on this morning is, what label does the world try to put on you? What label do you sometimes walk in? A label that leads you to a life of defeat. A label that makes you live below what God means for you to be. What label is it that the world tries to put on you? I stopped by to tell you that labels are for clothes, not for people. So again, this baby Moses was raised in the palace, but he may have dealt with being labeled. Because you see, his mom hid him for protection. Baby Moses, in his day, the king, Pharaoh, he thought that the Israelites had become too numerous. He looked at the Israelites and he thought that if they prosper, if they become even more numerous and war breaks out, then they're going to go against us Egyptians. And so we have to do something. King, that Pharaoh, looked around and saw all of these Israelites. So he put slave masters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. The Israelites, they faced brick and mortar. And it seemed that no matter what Pharaoh tried to do, these people still multiplied. So he wanted to make their lives more bitter, wanted to make their lives more harsh. He wanted to make sure that they had no personhood. And so even when the women were pregnant, Pharaoh told the midwives, when you're helping the Israelite women during childbirth, come on. If you see that it's a boy, make sure that you kill him. If it's a girl, we'll let them live. You know, that's just a woman. Come on. But if it's a boy, then you make sure you kill him. So Moses was hid. His mom hid him. And some may have thought, oh my goodness, how could that woman abandon her baby? Here is Moses, but she knew that if he was found, he would be killed. So she did what she had to do and set that baby right there afloat in a basket on the Nile River. Yes. So then he may have been labeled as unwanted. So not only was he hidden, not only was he, people may have thought he was abandoned and he was unwanted, but even Moses' very name, Moses, he was named Moses, which symbolized his condition. You see, he was found in the Nile River and he was pulled out of the river. Well, if you look up the name of Moses and you learn what his very name means, according to the Torah, the name Moses means, it comes from a Hebrew verb meaning to pull out, to draw out of water. And so the infant Moses was given this name by Pharaoh's daughter who rescued him from the Nile. So even his very name had the connotation of his situation. Even his name. How can you get past being named something that happened to you? How can you really get past being abandoned as a child? How can you really get past people looking at you and thinking that you're unwanted? How can you get past such label in your community? Oh, I know that boy. I know that boy. That's that Moses boy. parents left him. But the good news is when it comes to God being center in your life, no matter what the community thinks of you, no matter what society thinks of you, no matter how much they try to hold on to the labels, when God gets a hold of you, God does something that's bigger than your name, because then you're walking in the power of his name. Just check Moses' resume. This same baby had to grow up. So when the baby grew up, understand that he became a leader who inspired others to imagine a new and more just future. That's Moses. Check his resume. The baby grew up and he confronted Pharaoh. Maybe you've heard the song about Moses. Maybe you heard the saints of old. They said, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." When Moses was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. With 10 plagues, he forced Pharaoh to let those people go free. You see, when you have an assignment from God, nothing can stop the power of God to change a situation. He took the Israelites across the Red Sea, parted the waters as the people made exodus through from Egypt. He led them 40 years, wandering the wilderness, and even on Mount Sinai. Oh, on Mount Sinai, that same baby Moses grew up. And on Mount Sinai, he was given the law to be observed in the promised land. And Moses is even one of the authors of the Bible. That's right. That same little boy that they might have labeled, Moses was used by God and wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Law of Moses. God perfected Moses' life. Living beyond labels, God perfected Moses' life. His story, Moses' story, is an example of why we should never give up on God. You see, because the same way Moses had an extensive resume from being used by God, God is still writing your resume. God is giving you work to do. And it's not time to quit now. God has a job for you that goes beyond the labels that the world tries to put on you. So understand that people may not change. Attitudes may not change. You see, you can't make legislation that changes people's minds. Everyone is responsible for liberating their own mind. And so their minds may not change. But you need to do the good work that God gives you to do on this earth. You need to do the good work because you need to hear the Lord say, "Well done." So things may not change. People may not change. Minds may not change, but serve God anyway. Sacrifice anyway. Fast anyway. Pray anyway. Come to Bible study anyway. Come to church on Sunday anyway. Give anyway. Love anyway. Be peaceful anyway. Speak to them anyway. Smile at them anyway. You know why? Because Jesus Christ was crucified. And some labeled his work as blasphemous. The work that God has you to do, everyone won't always accept. Jesus died on the cross, and there were those who still did not accept his work. Yet he took the beating anyway. The mocking anyway. The spitting anyway. The nails anyway. The crown of thorns on his head anyway. The piercing in his side anyway. He bled anyway. He died Jesus got up, you need to have an anyway spirit on you. I'm going to serve God anyway. I'm going to praise God anyway. You can look at me any way you want to, but I'm going to give God praise. Because God never promised me an easy road. God never promised me that it would be easy. God never promised me that I'd feel pain. God never promised me that the pain would go away quickly. God never promised me that people wouldn't like me. God never promised me that it would be perfect. But God is bigger than any man. God is bigger than man-made labels. God is bigger than what they have to say about you. God is bigger than what they think about you. God is bigger than any name that they try to put on you. And what I love about God is that God gives you a new name. He gives you a new name. You don't have to worry about labels because you got a new name. Well, what does he call me, McCoy? He calls us sheep. God calls us saints. God calls us a holy nation. God calls us child of light. He calls you a royal priesthood. He calls you redeemed. I don't know about you, but I like those names.